Okay. I'm so sad I missed you guys last night. It's still, yeah.
But it's mainly
You were there, you just weren't there.
All right.
Hey,
Good to see you. Good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture. It's today's lecture on the politics of the energy transition. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome Professor David Spence from the University of Texas today for today's lecture. He is the Rex G. Baker Centennial Chair in Natural Resources Law at the University of Texas School of Law, and also teaches in the McCombs School of Business. And he is the author, most recently, of Climate of Contempt, How to Rescue the U.S. Energy Transition from Voter Partisanship. A timely subject. The election is but a few days away, and climate change is certainly an omnipresent concern. So we're very pleased in the Coleman P. Burke Center for Environmental Law to be able to sponsor today's event as part of the university's Climate Action Month series of events. I don't want to postpone your hearing for Professor Spence too long, but I will say a couple quick announcements. One, after the lecture, please join us upstairs in Ben's Place, just up the stairs right here, for a brief reception, an opportunity to further the conversation with Professor Spence. There will also be an opportunity to acquire copies of his book. If you would like one, there will be books for sale upstairs after the lecture. So please join us for that. But lastly, I should say, with all of these events, we're very appreciative of the late Coleman Burke, who endowed the center and helped make programs like this possible, and to the continuing support of the Burke family that allows us to do not only this programming, but also the things we do for our students and for the community in the area of environmental law. That's enough for me, because I'm certainly not why you're here. So without any further ado, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to introduce Professor David Spence this afternoon.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that nice introduction and for the invitation to come speak here today. And thank you to the Burke Center for sponsoring this event. I looked up Coleman Burke because I saw this sponsorship and learned that he was quite a supporter of environmental causes, not only the endowment of this center here at his law school alma mater, but also a big supporter of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts and California. Many of you know about that organization, so it's great to be associated with his name here. I appreciate that. And I want to thank Patty Harbold for handling all the logistics of this visit and making me feel welcome. I also thank you who came in person, and the countless millions who are watching online. For giving me your time. This book is about the energy transition and the politics thereof, and most people know what I mean when I say energy transition. We're talking about the idea of moving relatively rapidly, in fact quite rapidly in historical terms, toward a much lower carbon energy system in the United States. And while there is a lot of progress being made due to market forces, due to state policy action and other things, one of the premises of my book is that in order to get to get to or close to net zero carbon emissions in this country, we're going to need the cooperation of Congress and regulation that comes out of Congress limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And so a lot of the politics in the book, the political analysis, as you'll see when I go through it, a little bit of it is about how we build those congressional majorities in the future. The first thing that readers see in the book after the preface and the other front matter is the quote behind me from Bertrand Russell. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or by what you think could have socially beneficial effects if it were believed. This is a familiar idea to many people. This is about motivated reasoning. This is 20th century philosopher speak for motivated reasoning. And the reason I start with that quote is because I think the sort of central argument of the book is that today's information environment pushes us to do these things that Bertrand Russell warned us against much more powerfully than ever before in human history. And I think that is distorting our understanding of the energy transition, pretty much all aspects of the energy transition. And so the book is a deep dive into both the past, present, and future of energy transitions and energy regulation generally. And I'll show you the table of contents in just a second. So it's a bit of a wonky read, but if you want to be an energy policy wonk or a climate policy wonk, I think this is a good book for you. So here's the table of contents on the top part of this slide. And part one of the book is really a look at the history of the creation of today's energy regulatory state, the series of statutes that created the regulatory regimes or systems that we know today, and their evolution over the ensuing periods after their creation to now. And that, when I say part one, that's chapters 1 through 3 of the book. And one of the central arguments here is that the story that is most popular about the politics of the creation of regulatory legislation, the dominant narratives today, are underemphasizing part of the story. What we hear about all the time are the top-down parts of the story, how elites control the system is rigged by elites. In fact, both parties talk about a rigged system. They just disagree about who's doing the rigging and for what purpose. And we don't hear a lot of attention about the bottom-up forces that lead to the creation of major regulatory legislation. And so I tell a story in the first part of the book, in these first 3 chapters, that's not really the story of dark money funding merchants of doubt who put democracy in chains, to string together 3 book titles that you may have read. It's really more about voters. And we're missing the importance of how important voters are to members of Congress, how much they care about avoiding action that will risk their reelection prospects. And so that's the way I tell the story of the creation of these laws in chapter 1, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And that's also, I think, a key driver of the changes we saw in the late 20th century that caused more political polarization and gave birth to the deregulation movement that touched the energy industry in pretty profound ways. And I think it's also part of why we are seeing so much more negatively partisan behavior, negative partisanship among both voters and politicians in the 21st century. So that's where the story's going. Let me say a little bit more about each of those parts of the story. So I told you that chapter 1 looks at the creation of all these various regulatory regimes. As it turns out, a lot of the politics of their creation can be explained using a term that I borrow from another scholar called Republican moments, small r Republican. These are times in our history when a groundswell of demand for action, or at least dissatisfaction with the status quo among voters, is met by a receptive partisan environment in Congress such that members of Congress can champion their cause, the cause of those disaffected voters, and win support by championing legislation that addresses the problems that they're worried about. And previous energy transitions have involved responses on the part of Congress creating these sorts of regulatory bills or regulatory statutes that have essentially manifested in these Republican moments. And interestingly, they happen in really small windows of time in the history of Congress. All the statutes you see on the slide behind me were created either during the 30 years that straddled the turn of the 20th century, or the 6 years of the New Deal, or the 15 to 20 years surrounding the 1970s, which some people have called the environmental decade. Those are the times in which the groundswell of demand for action and the receptive partisan environment have been present. And it turns out, when you look closely at these things, there's sort of 2 kinds of receptive partisan environments that can trigger these Republican moments. One is when the issue is new and the parties are competing to champion it so as to win votes from voters. So we all know from American history that the progressive movement was one of those times when some Republicans, Teddy Roosevelt being the most prominent, and some Democrats, Woodrow Wilson and others, were competing to be the progressive party. Eventually Democrats won out for the most part on that on that issue, but in the meantime, there was bipartisanship that allowed majorities to be created in both houses of Congress and laws, statutes signed into law with support from both parties. Another type of receptive partisan environment is the kind you see during the New Deal, when Democrats had overwhelming dominance in both houses of Congress and they controlled the White House. And if you go to the Wikipedia page that shows you the distribution of the parties in Congress over time, go look at the years from 1933 to 1939. It'll blow your mind how big the Democrats' majorities were. The smallest majorities, for example, that Democrats had in the House, the smallest margins in the House of Representatives was 196 seats. They had 196 more seats than Republicans, and those margins got bigger over the ensuing 6 years, or the next 3 Congresses. And so that's an environment in which a party can do what it wants. And the Democrats did, and you see that long list of statutes that were passed under the New Deal. And so that's this chapter 1 tells about that story, along with, pardon me, I'm chewing ice, that's not polite, along with a little bit of more detail in describing some of the regimes that are particularly important to today's energy transition, that is, laws regulating public utilities and environmental laws, particularly the Clean Air Act. And so that's what chapter 1 is about. Chapter 2 starts to talk about the polarization that's getting in our way today. And in the late 20th century, sort of 2 phenomena happened. We started to see declining faith in regulation among the sort of policymaking class, particularly in the Republican Party, but not only in the Republican Party. And more favorable attitudes toward letting the market solve problems. At the same time, we saw the parties move apart ideologically. I'm showing you data from Pew Research here on the left and from another source on the right. Many of you may be familiar with the VoteView data that talks about polarization in Congress, but they all show a movement to the ideological right by the Republican Party after the Reagan administration. And then about 2 decades later, or 2 decades lagging that, you start to see movement to the left on the part of Democrats. And so as the parties move further apart, there's less common ground to be found, fewer in Congress, fewer ideological kindred spirits across the aisle to work with, to build majorities in support of major regulatory legislation. And that's a problem. We also see an anti-regulatory philosophy becoming much more prominent within the Republican Party. The idea, because of the lack of faith in what government and government-imposed solutions, we see regulation as becoming a non-starter over time for a lot of Republican politicians, as opposed to sticks, no, carrots, yes, perhaps, maybe, but sticks, definitely no. The other change that I deal with in part 1 of the book is the rise of negative partisanship in the American electorate and thereafter in Congress. So as it turns out, in the 21st century, there's been a sharp increase in enmity across party lines, as measured by political scientists. And again, I got some data from Pew on the left and data from the National Election Study on the right, and I'll explain what they are. But basically, Pew Research asks people whether they agree or disagree with or would support certain characterizations of members of the other party, and the negative characterizations are going up in both parties, to the point now that now a majority of people in both parties would describe the other party as unintelligent, dishonest, immoral, closed-minded. I don't know what's going on with lazy. Lazy is a one-party thing. I'm a Democrat, and I decided not to look into it because it's just too exhausting, too much effort. But thank you. You're the first group that's laughed at that joke. More alarming to me are the National Election Study data, which, for those of you who know the National Election Study, they run something called a feeling thermometer in their poll every 2 years during national elections or after national elections. And they ask patient respondents to apply their feeling thermometer to a whole bunch of things, institutions and other things. But among the questions they ask is, how do you feel about the other party? On a 0 to 100 scale, 100 being I could not love them more, 0 being I could not hate them more. And what we're seeing, sort of consistent with the Pew Research data, is that those attitudes are taking a sharp nosedive in the 21st century. Prior to the 21st century, members of each party gave the other party mildly negative scores in the low 40s. Now the median score is below 30, and it's probably below 20 now for both parties. It was 20 in 2022, but it's probably going to be below 20 for both parties in 2024. And alarming, not majorities, but alarming sized minorities are willing to assign a score of 0 to the other party. That's a statement of frankly, hatred toward the other party, at least in response to a poll question. And so that's unnerving. That's a sign of this, what political scientists would call affective polarization or negative polarization. It's an attachment to party as a way to stop the other party, as a way to stop the other party from gaining power and from getting what it wants. And it's conceptually distinct from issues or policies. It's about a cultural identification as well with your party. And so we're seeing that change in voters quite, in addition to, they're related, they overlap, but they're not quite the same thing as ideological polarization. And the third thing that's changing, that's making it harder for a Republican moment to happen now in response to concern about climate change, is that the set of voters to whom politicians respond are changing as well. And they're changing because more and more politicians represent safe seats. Seats that are so numerically dominated in the electorate by one party that they face, if they're the nominee of that party, they face virtually no risk of losing the general election. And because politicians do care about winning and keeping their job, they worry about other places where they might lose, and those other places are in the primary. Right? So the data you see in those maps use color intensity. These come from the Cook Political Report. Cook Political Report doesn't go back to the 70s. They only go back to the 90s. But they use color intensity to show how safe congressional seats are. These are House seats. And you can see even as recently as the late 90s, in the upper right-hand corner, the colors are fairly pale. There's some white and gray seats there. And districts were more competitive in the general election, and now this is a 2024 map in the lower right. Everything is bright blue or bright red, except for a few places that remain competitive. Most political scientists estimate that among House seats, 85% are safe now for one party or the other. It's kind of analogous to what you see on TV when people talk about the Electoral College and the election. There's only 7 states where the election's really going to be won or lost. This is kind of the same thing in the Congress. And so as those members representing safe seats have to please primary voters, the people they're pleasing are those especially ideologically extreme voters and especially negatively partisan voters who dominate primary elections. So when we see behavior from members of Congress that seem out of character with their previous behavior or performative, that's probably what's going on. They're sending signals to those primary voters to secure or guard their ideological flank or their re-election prospects. So those 3 things, more polarized electorate, more negatively partisan electorate, and members of Congress responding mostly to the most ideologically extreme and negatively partisan voters to protect their re-election prospects, are the 3 forces that make it much, much harder to produce a Republican moment today for climate policy, for strong climate policy, than might have been the case in the past. A majority of voters say they want stronger climate policy, and larger percentages of young Republicans say they want strong climate policy. But we're not seeing that translated into policy decisions in Congress, and instead we're seeing Republicans who champion strong climate policy jeopardizing their political future as a result. So Carlos Curbelo in Florida was sort of a champion of strong climate policy, and Bob Inglis from Kentucky? South Carolina as well. They either resigned or lost primaries, when they saw that, or because of, in part, the championing of that cause. And so the Republican Party in the 21st century has started to, according to polls, become less favorably disposed toward green energy than they were even a few years ago, and this could be a result of the forces that I've just been describing to you. So let's talk about part 2 of the book, which looks forward and gets at this information environment that I think is distorting our perception of the politics of this issue. Chapter 4 of the book, I'm going to spend more time on this part of the analysis than most of the other parts. Chapter 4 of the book provides a little bit of a history of the changing media environment in the United States, and makes the case that while politicians and lobbyists have always tried to exploit sort of familiar human biases and behavioral heuristics to try to get us to see the world the way they want us to see it, to form pictures in our mind's eye of their issue or character that are very favorable, and pictures of the other candidate or issue or perspective that are very unfavorable, promoting sort of misunderstanding and leveraging our emotion. They've always done that. But for most of the 20th century, the media acted as a check on that. They counteracted those forces in ways I'll describe in a second. And that's not true anymore. In the 21st century, it amplifies those efforts. It is I call it a perfect propaganda machine, or almost perfect propaganda machine, or at least the most powerful propaganda machine in human history. It seems ideally suited to those who would want to persuade us rather than educate us. And let me just go back and sort of unpack that a little bit. So when I was the age of students here in this law school, I had, and there's other people in here that I can tell have experienced this as well, I had 3 nightly newscasts, a half an hour each, a daily newspaper that was local. In fact, when I was little, we had 2 daily newspapers that were local, but daily newspapers are on the wane, and a national newspaper, and maybe we had a monthly or weekly news magazine like Time or Newsweek. Plenty of time to read all the things we wanted to read, to the last paragraph where all the qualifying information and caveats and nuance and complexity is found, and where you start to learn to expect that if you're reading it. That information was produced almost exclusively by journalists who had professional norms that told them that they should at least aspire to be objective and complete in the stories they write. That aspiration wasn't always met, but it was a norm to aspire to that, and they had to please editors who might have different views than they do about political issues and so forth. And the news was delivered sort of slowly. Nobody had to worry about getting scooped, at least until the next day. And I didn't have to worry about more news coming at me, at least until the next day. And we would talk about the news. We'd gather that information from these sort of professional journalists writing for an ideologically heterogeneous, broad audience. And we would form political beliefs by talking to one another face to face. I talked to my family, I talked to my friends, my neighbors, my coworkers, with all the context that face-to-face communication entails. And that means not just facial cues or body language, but knowing the other person and having a relationship with the other person. Not only is that a position of trust, but it's also a relationship you typically want to maintain. So the way you talk about issues would be careful and iterative and cautious, because you don't want to start a conversation by saying something that offends the other person. You don't really learn from each other or learn anything that way. And so that's how political beliefs were formed in the pre-internet era. And you see where I'm going here. That's not the way it is anymore. Now you still have those kind of outlets, journalism-based outlets that write for broad audiences, but they're competing with a fire hose of other information that comes from people who want to persuade you more than they want to educate you. And this can be bots, this can be press releases, this can be advocacy journalism. It can be lots of things, but students in particular have this sense that they're being spun all the time. And finding the good information and separating it out from the information that's trying to push you in a particular political direction takes a lot of effort these days. More effort than it should, or than it used to have to anyway. And not only that, we all know that algorithms begin to censor the information we seek. When we click on something, we're going to get more of that. If we don't click on something, we're going to get less of that. The same thing happens in social groups. That social process of belief formation online is very different because it's anonymous. We don't know how many people are paying attention to what we're saying. People exit groups if they don't like the sort of dominant norms or the dominant views in that group, or sometimes they're chased away by members of the group. And so you start to see people processing news that's been censored in the first place in these very homogeneous filter bubbles, to borrow the term from the popular book by that name, ideologically insulated communities where everything happens much, much more quickly. The news comes at you fast. There's a temptation, because you fear missing something, to not read to that last paragraph. A lot of it's coming from people other than trained journalists. And we're talking about it with anonymous, semi-anonymous people on Twitter and other sort of social media platforms like that, in front of a potential audience, which also changes the way we talk to each other. And a conversation on Twitter is not really the same or as real or as genuine a conversation because of that audience, for the same reason that reality TV isn't real. There's people watching, and that changes how we do things. So that's a very different world than existed the last time Congress was able to produce Republican moments in the environmental decade of the 1970s. And it's turned many of us, people who are online, it turns us all into lobbyists. We become lobbyists instead of learners, or in addition to learners, I suppose, because of those various dynamics that I just described. That affects how we talk about the challenge before us, which is trying to build congressional majorities for a stronger climate policy and to hasten the energy transition. And the book, well, let me just say one more thing before I move on to that conversation. The chapter 4 summarizes a pretty extensive body of literature from political behavior, political psychology, sociology, anthropology, communication, and media studies, in support of the idea that there's something about all of these destructive dynamics that is addictive. I think I often want to quote a friend, a writer who went to the University of North Carolina and wrote a book about the basketball rivalry between Duke and North Carolina called "To Hate Like This Is to Be Happy Forever." And there's something addictive about working up that hatred. And this is captured in a famous Aldous Huxley quote that I use in one of the chapters about sort of looking down on someone else being a delicious moral treat. And so that addictiveness part of the internet is also part of what's going on here. And we've got to somehow find a way to break out of it. And chapter 5 of my book is really about how do we break out of it when we talk about the trade-offs that are going to be necessary to get to a net zero carbon emission future. And that is a really, really complicated and difficult task. And lots of people are working on it. The encouraging part of it is that lots and lots of people are working on it. Lots of bright people are working on the technology side of this in particular. The energy system has always faced a tension between making energy reliable, making it affordable, and making it clean. And some of the trade-offs between those values are getting easier in certain places and at certain times because of technological advancement. But that doesn't mean they're easy. Too many people, because of the dynamics online that I described a second ago, too many people are too certain about too many things when it comes to the transition, and they're certain in opposite directions. Too many people are certain that we can never get off of fossil fuels consistent with human flourishing. And other people are just as certain that a transition will not include and cannot include fossil fuels if we're going to get to net zero. And we don't really know either of those things. I've been in the energy field a long time, and we're terrible about predicting specific technological change. The first edition of the textbook for law students that I'm a co-author of predicted that shale gas and oil would not be exploitable in our lifetimes. And I don't really think anybody really predicted how cheap solar panels would get this fast. Maybe some people say they did, but I was around then. I don't recall anyone predicting this. And so we can predict that technological advancement will happen, but we're not very good at predicting where or when. And so part of the argument in chapter 5 here is that we ought to be a little more cautious and agnostic about the techno-economic future, and we ought to not rule out any pathways that might turn out to be best in the sense of being affordable, reliable, and clean. Yet if you're in these online communities, these energy social media communities, you see lots of people arguing that we cannot have this. We see essentially partisanship about technology and partisanship about policy instruments. Or more accurately, anti-partisanship about some technologies and anti-partisanship about some regulatory instruments as well. And as somebody who's been around this for a long time, it's not making a lot of sense to me to do that. What's possible in the future, on both of those dimensions, is really difficult to predict. And then the last chapter of the book talks about looking forward and trying to change these dynamics. And it's called Hope and Conversation. That's a hopeful title. What I found was when I looked at the research on persuasion, on how we get people to change their minds about things, it's not about giving them the information we have so that they can understand things the way we do and reach the same conclusions we do. Scholars of influence and persuasion long ago rejected the information deficit theory of persuasion. It's really about talking to people with whom you have a relationship of trust and talking to them in ways that get them to audit their own views. And that happens over time. It doesn't happen quickly. It takes a while. It takes iterated conversations over time. And what I found when I looked at the research from all these different fields was that they were all pointing to this same prescription. So some of you may know Katherine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist and a climate communicator. She's written an entire book about this called Saving Us. She's, I sort of describe her approach to this, but we see the same thing from political scientists who talk about deep canvassing as a way of just asking questions of people and asking and getting their answers and listening, active listening, using what they say to formulate the next question. So for example, why don't you like that wind farm? Well, I'm worried about my friend who lives near it, and I've read about wind turbine syndrome, and I'm afraid he's going to get sick. Well, what does your friend think? Is he worried about wind turbine syndrome? I don't know the answer to that, but you can imagine if the friend isn't worried, or if he doesn't know if the friend's worried, he'll go ask the friend. But let's say the friend is worried. What if wind turbine syndrome isn't an idea that scientists support. Would you still worry about it? Well, this is the idea. You keep asking questions. You don't tell them what's true. You don't tell them what they ought to think. You have a conversation. And those conversations involve learning on both sides. They involve the possibility that you'll change your mind on something too. And this is something I can tell you that this is something that big companies who try to do things in very contentious places already know. They already understand that they're distrusted and they have to build trust with local communities. And this is something that smaller companies, like clean energy companies, are learning now because they're running into the same kind of opposition, local opposition to their projects as well. And so persuasion is not something that happens quickly. And as we sit here 5 days away from an election about which probably almost everyone in this room feels pretty strongly or urgently, whatever your choice, whatever your preference is, this is a hard thing to accept. If you feel urgently about the climate problem, it's a hard thing to accept that it's a bottom-up problem that needs to be solved with a bottom-up solution, or at least that's going to be a big part of the solution. But that's the case I'm making, and that's what the literature shows me is the case here. And so I think the idea here is to try and instill what one of the psychologists I quote calls actively open-minded thinking norms in public conversation. How do you do that? Well, it's a lot easier to do offline than online. You don't have, most of us have more trust relationships with people offline in person than we do online, but maybe you have some online, maybe you're trusted in your social media group. It involves defending the dissenter. It involves not chasing off the dissenter, asking the dissenter why do they feel the way they do, if you're going to do this online, and if it's in person, you can do that face-to-face. And establishing these norms of actively open-minded thinking is not only the best way to persuade people about climate, it's also the best way to repair what is a pretty broken democracy right now. Some of you may know Timothy Snyder's book, Tyranny's in the title. I can't remember the rest of it. He's the historian you sometimes see in the pages of the op-ed page of the New York Times, who's worried about a transition to an authoritarian government here in the United States because he sees some of the same phenomena happening here that's happened in other transitions to authoritarianism. His little book, which is an easy read, I would recommend it to everyone, talks about this very problem. We have to take responsibility for what we say online. We have to give people who disagree with us a little bit of grace and ask them questions about why they feel the way they do. In the introduction to my book, I quote Pete Buttigieg as saying, you talk to people about these things the way you talk to a family member who you know would give you the shirt off their back and does kind things for people, but the moment they open their mouth about politics, it horrifies you. I paraphrase, but I know he said the word horrifies. And we need to create those kind of norms everywhere that we can, as far as I'm concerned, in order to make progress toward creating voters in the right places who are demanding of their elected representatives that they address the problems that people are concerned about, and climate change being one of them. Let me close by showing you a figure from, it's not from my book, it's from another paper. The citation is at the bottom there, but it was reproduced by Pew Research in their most recent poll. And it shows that the polarization and negative partisanship problem is caused by overrepresentation of the most negatively partisan people in all aspects of our life. It's those people on the edges who perceive the biggest gap between the parties. The most partisan left-leaning people and the most partisan right-leaning people perceive a bigger gap than other people do. These are the people that are online, active in online conversations, and these are the people that vote in primaries, and or disproportionately vote in primaries. So it's not, their perceptions seem to be driving this debate these days, and one of the hopeful things is that when we look more closely at the less active partisans, we see a lot more room for agreement on certain things. If we can get those less active partisans to be active voters, and we can talk to them and develop relationships, maybe we'll have a world where Congress has some ideological overlap again. Right now they have none, and they haven't had any in either House of Congress for more than 20 years. So I'll stop there because I said I would leave 20 minutes for questions, and so thank you for your attention. There's a mic back here, and if you have a question, raise your hand. Oh, let me say one more thing. Sorry. I forgot to mention, when I looked up Coleman Burke, I also went and looked up his political donations. He was a real estate, made money in real estate, and all his donations were to Republicans, including Lynn Cheney. Environmentalist, Republican. I was represented by liberal Republicans growing up in Western New York when I was a kid. These people still exist. They're out there, but they're not being heard from, I think. I meant to say that when I was talking about him at the beginning, and I didn't want to forget. Sorry, go ahead, sir.
Is it on? Yeah, great. Thanks for a really interesting presentation of your book. I can't wait to get my hands on it. So I have a question for you. I'm not in a position to disagree with your analysis of our polity. Sounds good to me. But I wonder what you make of the Inflation Reduction Act. Because this could be the most transformational piece of congressional legislation, and it happened amidst the political climate that you described.
Yeah. So I didn't talk about it today, but I do discuss it in some detail in the book. It's not a regulatory statute, it's carrots. I guess there's one stick in there, the methane fee. But the rest of it is incentives, right? Subsidies in the form of tax credits. But really, really powerful subsidies. I mean, unprecedentedly large tax credits that are accessible to a much wider group of users of those credits than ever before, and applicable to a broad array of projects. And they last for 10 years. So this is all, in scope, a much, much bigger thing. And the idea, part of the political theory behind that statute is that it will create economic constituencies in favor of people who see their economic self-interest as tied to the energy transition, which then might change their votes. And there are also people who believe it will change the way it'll change the case for executive branch action to address greenhouse gas emissions as well. I think the IRA is a powerful incentivizer of green energy projects, which will beget technological improvement in those projects, or economies of scale and production that will make them cheaper. I'm skeptical of the argument that it will transform politics the way some people hope it will, for the reasons I've described already, and I'm skeptical of the argument that it essentially will create the authority for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act the way they're trying to do under the Biden and EPA's new power plant rule. If you want to dive into either of those, I'd be happy to explain, but it's pretty esoteric. But I think in terms of if people's economic interests change their votes, then the Inflation Reduction Act could by itself change our politics in pretty transformational ways. I'm dubious that that's going to be the case. For the same reason you see people who voted against the IRA taking credit for the projects that come to their districts, right? They don't see much risk in doing that because they feel confident that that's not going to jeopardize their reelection. Yes, sir.
My question is, isn't there a real danger of a backlash from the bottom up as the 100+ Biden-Harris regulations are actually implemented? I'm talking about eliminating 30% of gas car production in 2 years, 50% in 5 years, and not only the car production, but all the related jobs. And similarly, you know, you can't buy a gas stove, you can't buy a gas furnace. You mentioned the power plants being closed down, you know, the fossil fuel power plants. Isn't it likely the voters are going to have a big backlash?
So the Biden administration is not banning gas stoves or gas-fired power plants. Some local communities are banning gas hookups, although a lot of those have been struck down by courts as being preempted by state energy laws or by the federal energy laws. But I think your larger point is if the transition goes too fast and voters become unhappy, won't that produce a backlash? Yeah, and I think you can have a backlash if the transition jeopardizes reliability of energy or makes energy too expensive for people. That's where I see the risk of a backlash, and that's part of the reason I believe in sort of being technologically agnostic about these things. We can get to net zero energy lots of different ways, and sort of keeping the eyes on that prize, which is reducing atmospheric carbon, which is what's warming the planet and causing these problems. Seems to me to be let the market decide how we get there, or let people decide how we get there if that's a requirement. So I could see backlash if power goes out too much because of mandated changes in the power sector, or if gasoline or electricity, if you have an electric car, becomes too expensive and can be directly tied to sort of policies that push the energy transition along. I don't know that that's going to be the case. I don't know that it's not going to be the case. I have a lot of, I don't predict that sort of thing, but yeah. Yes.
Thanks. So climate policy is obviously a partisan and a partisanly charged issue in the current world, particularly in the United States. But how does it affect your analysis that it's probably actually less partisanly charged than a great many other issues? In the sense that I think there's probably something closer to convergence on a lot of climate questions between different partisans on the left and right than there are on other issues that may well be driving some of that more virulent teamism. And so the fact that we might say, okay, well, I would love to vote for somebody who's more moderate on X, but they don't recognize that I'm a human being, so I'm not interested in doing that, right? That sort of thing is is that an impediment to your approach?
No, it's part of my approach. I mean, I talk about that same sort of, the way the rhetoric causes mutual alienation, which I think is what you're saying here. The chapter on the media, cites a lot of examples on both sides of the partisan aisle of really over-the-top rhetoric that ascribes immorality to entire groups of people. These kind of attribution errors are made much more easily in this environment than they would have been in the past, because a lot of people are only they're not encountering those people that are being maligned in real life. And so it's easier to form these pictures in their head of how evil they are. And it happens on both sides of the aisle. It's not symmetrical in terms of what the research says, in terms of the amounts of misinformation and negative hyperbole, but it's not insignificant on the left either. There's more of it on the right than the left, but there's enough of it happening, too much of it happening everywhere. And so, yeah, that cycle of alienation is something that I dive into in the book in some detail. So I think that's part of what the new media environment creates. And the idea that, and some people you shouldn't walk away from this saying, I'm not online, this isn't happening to me, because it affects offline media as well. So as traditional media lose, as the business case for traditional media outlets declines, they have to compete to get attention, and they do so at least in part by emulating these new media companies. And that means more grabby headlines that aren't quite accurate, that appeal to your negative sort of fears. It also is the case that reporters in traditional media spend their time online looking for stories and looking for experts. And then there's the partisans you see in the two large bars here, the people who are online, they're also sort of the connectors, Malcolm Gladwell type connectors, to the offline world, spreading ideas as well. And so the perception of the overall debate becomes more intensely negative and polarized.
Hi, I graduated from the University of Rochester, so I'm familiar with Western New York. So you may be familiar with how in New York State, it is the one that's most receptive to third parties. There's 5 active third parties, and a politician can lose a primary, but then have a line with a minor party, like conservative or other parties, and then win the election or get cross-endorsed by another major party. In this polarized environment, are minor parties going to become pivotal? Or independents like a Bernie Sanders type become pivotal?
Yeah. And Senator Murkowski did something similar when she lost her primary. But she had so much name recognition, right? I mean, she was sort of an institution there, or is an institution there in Alaska. Historically, third parties eventually get absorbed into the two big parties. That's sort of how it's worked historically in the past. And when people are feeling so urgently about the need to stop the other party from gaining power, it inhibits the impulse to vote for third parties in national elections. And so I think it's a rough go right now for third parties in running for a congressional seat or for the presidency. It's just a rough go. And to say nothing of the institutional barriers that the two big parties put up to third party candidacies. So that would be my first take on that, but that's a good question I hadn't much thought about. I'm from Rochester, too. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I find it really interesting when you say, don't just ignore the people that are online. How would you suggest that as individuals we might interact with the progressive activists and the devoted conservatives, especially online? Because when I see it online, I'm just like, oh, this does not concern me. I'm just going to scroll by. This is not something that I think is healthy to consume.
Well, good instincts in the sense of it isn't healthy. But so I didn't say this in my initial remarks, but there's a debate about how many people are persuadable, what percentage of people are persuadable, even using these techniques. Catherine Hayhoe would say everybody's persuadable. She thinks that's true. I think if you look at the polling data on how that try to measure the sort of subsets of the electorate, there's a couple of polls, one from Gallup, one from Pew, that's both of which, they use different categories, but they both imply that probably a third of people are persuadable. So we all may have, as I said, I'm a Democrat, so I have a brother-in-law who is sort of a MAGA Republican, and he, talking to him, he wants to provoke me. So it'd be hard for, he sort of gets his kicks out of, provoking me. So it's hard to have an extended conversation with him, but I also know people who vote Republican who are not that way. And if it's your family member or a close friend, you can have these careful, questioning conversations with them and this will go the other direction too, that would make them, hopefully, the idea here is to make them think twice as they're consuming their ideological media, think twice about generalizing negatively about a group to which they know you belong, and they've been talking to you about these issues, and you've put a human face on that group. One of the things I say is being in Texas, in Austin, puts a human face on the oil industry. I have students who go work in the oil and gas industry. And I have friends who in other places who, generalize with hyperbolic ways about the oil industry. And that's your question over here. That when people see that, they see somebody dismissing them. They feel alienated by that. And so, I rambled a little bit, but I think I answered your question. Yeah.
Mine is sort of a carryover or carry-on question, but more about how you're seeing things with Gen Z and younger millennials. They're experiencing this in real time and impacts that are more aggressive and more impactful than, us elder millennials and older have seen some of this stuff. So I was just curious if you think that's going to impact kind of these divisions that we see and how people are approaching these, because I have some very close friends, part of the Conservative Energy Network, that are Republican, and I wouldn't say you're far devoted conservatives necessarily, but they are very concerned about these things, and I'm just curious if you think the generation shift and the impacts they're facing are going to determine some of this.
There's a whole bunch of different dimensions to that question that are being studied in some of these literatures. One of them is about, if you grow up on the internet, do you lose the ability to talk to people productively in person? Because it's not so much you lose the ability, you just don't develop it, right? And so it bleeds into offline conversations, which are more awkward than they would be had people been talking to each other about difficult issues all along and face to face. Another set of issues relate to the idea that younger people are generally more supportive of stronger climate policy, although there was a weird poll recently saying Gen Z in particular was more likely to vote for Trump than any other subcategory of voters, including boomers. That was a poll from about a week ago. Although how you define the generations also probably influences that too. I'm hopeful that, I also think that people who grow up on the internet are going to, and the internet has been dominated by younger people generally, they're going to have experiences that show them that the way they're gathering information may not be serving them well. So an extreme version of this is the guy that showed up at the pizza place in Washington, D.C. with the AR-15, thinking he was going to bust up a child trafficking ring, and when he was arrested, he said, in all sincerity, I guess I had bad information, right? And now, that's not going to be the kind of dramatic example that everybody has, but if we're certain about things that aren't true, we're eventually going to find out that that's the case. And I'm also hopeful that people will become more discerning consumers of information online over time, and more receptive, therefore, as they learn that it's not serving them well, to other ways to gather information and process that information to form their beliefs. Victor.
When you go back in history and you look at politics in areas that were oftentimes dominated by one party, such as the Democrats in the South, Republicans in the Arizona area or Orange County, you often saw something of cross-party registration. So I might be liberal, but I register as a conservative Democrat, or I register as a Republican, so I can influence their primary.
Yeah.
Because you can't influence your own primary. And it strikes me that would seem to be somewhat of a natural reaction to extremely gerrymandered districts. Is there any evidence that might occur or could occur, or should we be pushing that to occur?
That's a great question. I don't know, in terms of rigorous sort of study of that issue, I don't know whether it's happening more than it used to. I've heard stories about particular efforts for people in one place to register to try and influence the primary of the other party. But you could also argue that the way that some people do that to create a more extreme opponent for the party they like.
Well, right. We have absolutely seen examples of that. But it seems like it could also work the other way.
So there are strategic voters out there, and so there's probably, I just don't know how widespread that is or whether it's on the rise. I wish I knew the answer to that. There's probably somebody who is studying that. I just don't know who that is. I mean, my grandmother always registered as a Republican in her rural town because she thought it was necessary to get her road plowed when the snow came. So, there's all kinds of reasons why people might do that. But that's a good question. I'd like to look into that now that you've raised it.
We're going to have to call it there, but I'm sure if you have more questions, Professor Spence would be happy to answer them upstairs in Ben's place at the reception. There will also be books available up there. Please join me in thanking Professor Spence for and certainly check out our website for future events. We have a range of events planned for next semester, and certainly hope to see you back here for those as well. Thank you very much.